The sun was setting over Pine Valley as Maya Lee pulled out of the animal shelter's parking lot, her heart full from spending the afternoon helping abandoned puppies find their forever homes. At 17, she'd already racked up over 500 volunteer hours, making her the shelter's most dedicated young volunteer. The familiar route home felt peaceful, with the warm spring breeze flowing through her slightly opened windows and her favorite playlist humming softly in the background. Maya checked her watch, 6:45 p.m. Perfect timing to get home for family dinner, a cherished tradition in the Lee household. Her dad, a respected FBI special agent, always made it home for these dinners unless he was working on a major case. Tonight he promised to be there, and she was excited to tell him about the 3 puppies that had been adopted that day. The silver Honda Civic she drove was a gift from her parents for maintaining straight A's while balancing her volunteer work. It wasn't flashy, but it was her pride and joy, and she kept it spotlessly clean. She'd even installed a small dashboard camera, her dad's suggestion, calling it a smart precaution in today's world. As she approached the intersection of Maple and Oak Street, Maya carefully came to a complete stop, just as she'd been taught. She'd driven this route hundreds of times before, and her driving record was perfect, not even a parking ticket. The setting sun painted the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink, and she took a moment to appreciate the view before proceeding through the intersection. The sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror caught her completely off guard. Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, remembering everything her father had taught her about traffic stops. She signaled and pulled over to the right, positioning her car safely away from traffic. Her hands moved automatically, turn off the engine, place keys on the dashboard, interior lights on, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Through her side mirror, she watched as Officer Brooks emerged from his patrol car. Something about his approach seemed off. His hand was already resting on his holster, his stance aggressive rather than cautious. Maya took a deep breath, trying to stay composed despite the growing knot in her stomach. She reached over and adjusted her phone on the dashboard mount, making sure it had a clear view of her window. "Good evening, officer," Maya said politely as he approached, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. The response she received wasn't what she expected. No greeting, no explanation for the stop, just a harsh demand for her license and registration. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the documents in her glove compartment, movements slow and deliberate to avoid any misunderstandings. The next few minutes would change everything. As Officer Brooks examined her documents, his comments grew increasingly inappropriate. "This is a nice car for someone like you," he remarked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Where did you get it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that made Maya's chest tighten. She maintained her composure, explaining clearly that it was a gift from her parents, and her father was an FBI agent. Instead of diffusing the situation, this information seemed to agitate Officer Brooks further. His demeanor shifted from suspicious to openly hostile, and Maya could feel the situation spiraling out of control. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Maya realized this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. She discreetly pressed the emergency contact button on her phone, another safety measure her father had insisted upon. What started as a peaceful drive home was about to become something much more significant, not just for Maya and her family, but for the entire community. The air grew thick with tension as Officer Brooks returned to her window, his face now set in a harsh expression that made Maya's heart race. She couldn't have known it then, but this moment would spark a chain of events that would expose deep-rooted problems in local law enforcement and lead to changes that would ripple through the entire system. For now, though, she was just a scared teenager trying to handle a situation that was quickly spinning beyond her control. Officer Brooks's flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, shining directly into Maya's eyes. She squinted against the harsh light, her heart pounding but her voice remaining steady. The peaceful evening had transformed into something entirely different, and she could feel the weight of every second ticking by. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Brooks commanded, his voice carrying an edge that made Maya's skin crawl. She glanced at her phone, still recording on the dashboard, and carefully reached for the door handle. Her father's words echoed in her mind, "Stay calm, be respectful, but know your rights." The evening air had grown cooler, and Maya wrapped her arms around herself as she stood beside her car. Officer Brooks towered over her, his body language intimidating. The patrol car's flashing lights painted everything in alternating red and blue, creating strange shadows that made the familiar street feel alien and threatening. "Where did you really get this car?" Officer Brooks demanded again, circling Maya's Honda like a predator. His boots scraped against the pavement with each step. "These kinds of vehicles don't usually belong to people like you." The pause in his sentence spoke volumes, making his prejudice clear without using explicit words. Maya stood her ground, though her legs felt like jelly. "Sir, as I mentioned, this is my car. My parents gave it to me for my birthday. My father is FBI Special Agent Lee, and you can verify." "Don't tell me how to do my job." Officer Brooks cut her off, his voice rising. "I've heard every story in the book. FBI agent father? Sure. And I'm the president." His sarcasm dripped with disdain as he continued his intimidating circle around the vehicle. A few cars drove past slowly, their occupants craning their necks to watch the scene unfold. Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her composure. She'd done nothing wrong, and she knew it. The stop sign, the alleged reason for pulling her over, was clearly visible from where they stood, and she knew without a doubt she'd made a complete stop. "Officer, may I please make a phone call to my father?" Maya asked politely, keeping her hands visible at her sides. "He can confirm everything I've told you." She watched as a mixture of emotions crossed Officer Brooks's face. Annoyance, anger, and something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You can make your call from the station," he replied, reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the evening air. "Right now, you're being detained for suspicious behavior and possible vehicle theft." Maya's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, please, this is a misunderstanding. I have all the vehicle documentation right here in the glove compartment. We can clear this up quickly if you'll just—" "Hands behind your back," Officer Brooks barked, cutting off her explanation. His command drew the attention of more passing cars, several of which had now pulled over to watch. Maya could see people holding up their phones, recording the incident. Under different circumstances, she might have felt embarrassed by all the attention, but right now, those witnesses and their cameras felt like a lifeline. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Maya's wrists as Officer Brooks secured them, tighter than necessary. She winced but didn't complain, knowing that staying calm was her best option. Her phone was still recording in the car, capturing every word, every action. She silently thanked her father for insisting on that dashboard mount. As Officer Brooks began reciting her rights, Maya noticed Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor, walking her dog nearby. The woman had stopped in her tracks, mouth agape at the scene unfolding before her. Maya caught her eye, and Mrs. Thompson immediately pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen, hopefully calling for help. The situation had escalated from a simple traffic stop to an arrest in less than 15 minutes. Maya stood beside her car, handcuffed, while Officer Brooks called for a patrol car to transport her to the station. The evening had grown darker, but numerous headlights illuminated the scene as more cars slowed to witness what was happening. Maya took slow, deep breaths, focusing on staying composed. She knew her father would move heaven and earth to fix this situation, but right now, she needed to keep her wits about her. The patrol car's lights continued their rhythmic flashing, marking time like a metronome as Maya waited, knowing that this night would change not just her life, but the lives of many others in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The backup patrol car arrived with its lights flashing but siren silent, adding to the surreal quality of the evening. Maya watched as curious neighbors gathered on their front lawns, many still in their dinner clothes, phones held high to record the scene. The spring evening had grown chilly, but Maya barely noticed, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Please, just check my registration again," Maya tried one last time as the second officer approached. This one was younger, Officer Chen according to his nameplate, and he glanced between Maya and Officer Brooks with barely concealed uncertainty. "The car belongs to me and my father." "I said that's enough," Officer Brooks snapped, grabbing Maya's upper arm to guide her toward the patrol car. His grip was uncomfortably tight, though not enough to leave marks. Maya noticed Officer Chen's slight frown at his colleague's roughness, a detail she filed away in her memory. Mrs. Thompson had moved closer, her small dog yapping at the commotion. "I'm calling her parents right now," she announced loudly, a phone pressed to her ear. "This is completely unnecessary, officers. I've known this girl since she was in kindergarten." Officer Brooks ignored the older woman, but Maya felt a surge of gratitude. More neighbors had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the scene. She recognized Mr. Patel from the corner house, still wearing his chef's apron, and the Rodriguez family from across the street, their young kids watching wide-eyed from behind their parents. As Officer Brooks opened the patrol car's back door, Maya's phone chimed loudly from inside her car, her father's special ringtone. Officer Chen glanced at it, then at Officer Brooks. "Sir, maybe we should wait and verify." "Are you telling me how to do my job, rookie?" Officer Brooks cut him off sharply. "This is my stop, my arrest. She's given us multiple suspicious stories, and the vehicle doesn't match the profile of." "Of what exactly?" called out Mr. Rodriguez, his voice carrying clearly across the scene. "A teenager driving a Honda. My daughter drives the same model." Several other neighbors murmured in agreement, phones still recording. Maya found herself being guided into the back seat of the patrol car, the familiar smell of leather and cleaning supplies filling her nostrils. Through the window, she could see her own car, still idling with the dashboard camera recording everything. Officer Chen lingered by her Honda, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The inside of the patrol car felt claustrophobic, the plastic partition separating the front and back seats adding to her sense of unreality. Maya's wrists ached from the handcuffs, but she forced herself to stay calm, remembering her father's advice about keeping track of every detail during difficult situations. Through the window, she watched Officer Chen approach her car again, this time leaning in to look at her registration more closely. His body language showed growing concern, and he pulled out his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. Maya silently urged him to check her story, to verify her father's identity. Mrs. Thompson was now practically shouting into her phone, her usually quiet demeanor forgotten in her outrage. "Yes, they're taking her to the station now. This is absolutely ridiculous. She's just a child, and they won't even properly check her registration." The patrol car's radio crackled to life, and Maya caught fragments of conversation, something about verification and federal credentials. Officer Brooks's face, visible in the rearview mirror, showed a flicker of uncertainty for the first time. Officer Chen approached the driver's window, speaking in low tones that Maya couldn't quite hear. More patrol cars had arrived, their lights creating a disco-like effect on the quiet suburban street. Maya could see neighbors talking animatedly amongst themselves, some on phones, others recording, all watching intently. The situation had drawn more attention than Officer Brooks had probably anticipated, and Maya could sense his growing discomfort. Suddenly, a loud, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. Maya's phone was ringing again, this time on speaker through her car's Bluetooth system. The voice that filled the air made Officer Brooks's face pale slightly. "This is FBI Special Agent Lee. Who is the commanding officer on scene, and why is my daughter being detained?" The neighborhood fell silent except for the idling engines and the quiet hum of Maya's car stereo broadcasting her father's voice. Officer Chen looked directly at Officer Brooks, waiting to see how he would handle this development. In the back of the patrol car, Maya closed her eyes briefly, relief washing over her. The truth was about to come out, and this nightmare would soon be over, though its repercussions would echo far beyond this spring evening on a quiet suburban street. Special Agent Lee sat in the FBI task force meeting, his phone set to silent as they discussed an upcoming operation. The device kept lighting up with notifications, but protocol demanded his full attention during briefings. It wasn't until they took a 5-minute break that he finally checked his messages, and his world turned upside down. 3 missed calls from Maya, 5 from Mrs. Thompson, 2 voicemails, 7 text messages. His heart dropped as he played the first voicemail, Mrs. Thompson's usually gentle voice filled with urgency. "They're arresting her, right in front of our houses. She didn't do anything wrong." The second voicemail was from Maya's phone, but it wasn't a message. It was the ambient audio from her car, captured when she hit the emergency contact button. The sound of Officer Brooks's hostile voice made Agent Lee's blood run cold. 20 years of FBI training kept him outwardly calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. "I need to handle a family emergency," he announced to his team leader, already heading for the door. His colleague, Agent Wilson, caught his eye. They'd worked together for 15 years, and she could read the tension in his stance. Without a word, she grabbed her laptop and followed him. In his office, Agent Lee's fingers flew across his keyboard. Traffic camera footage from Maya's route home appeared on one screen while Agent Wilson pulled up Officer Brooks's service record on another. A pattern began emerging, one that made Agent Lee's jaw clench tighter with each new detail. 6 complaints in the past year alone, Agent Wilson murmured, scrolling through the records, all dismissed without proper investigation, all involving young minority drivers. She glanced at her friend and colleague, seeing the careful control in his expression. Agent Lee accessed Maya's phone remotely, a security measure they'd set up together, and downloaded the dashboard camera footage. The video was crystal clear, showing every moment of the unfounded traffic stop. His daughter's calm voice, the officer's escalating aggression, the gathering neighbors. "Look at this," Agent Wilson called out, pulling up more records. "Brooks has a history of random stops in that neighborhood. The statistics are far from random." She turned her laptop, showing a clear pattern of targeted harassment that had somehow slipped through the department's oversight. Agent Lee's phone rang, the local police chief finally returning his calls. The conversation was brief but intense. "Your officer has arrested my 17-year-old daughter on false pretenses," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of federal law enforcement experience. "I'm looking at her dashboard camera footage right now. This ends tonight." As he spoke, more data poured in. Mrs. Thompson had rallied the neighbors, and videos from multiple angles were being uploaded to social media. The local news had picked up the story. Officer Brooks's body camera footage, which should have been recording, was mysteriously inactive during the stop. Agent Wilson pulled up even more records, similar incidents in Brooks's previous precinct, transfer papers that glossed over complaints, performance reviews that ignored red flags. "They let him move around instead of addressing the problem," she noted grimly. "Classic case of passing the trash." Agent Lee stood at his desk, phone in one hand, badge in the other. The room hummed with computers processing data, building an irrefutable case. He thought of Maya, alone in that patrol car, staying strong despite the injustice. His daughter had done everything right, followed every safety protocol they'd practiced, kept her composure, created a clear record of events. "I'm going to get her," he said quietly, his calm voice belying the determination in his eyes. "But this isn't just about Maya anymore." He looked at the wall of evidence they'd assembled in less than 30 minutes. "This is about every person Brooks has targeted, every complaint that was ignored, every officer who looked the other way." Agent Wilson was already making calls, setting things in motion. In the surveillance footage still playing on one screen, neighbors continued gathering around Maya's car, their phones raised, bearing witness. Something larger than a single traffic stop was unfolding, a moment when years of unchecked abuse of power would finally face scrutiny. As Agent Lee headed for the door, his team was already mobilizing. This wouldn't be a scene of angry confrontation or personal revenge. This would be justice, served cold and clear, backed by federal authority and irrefutable evidence. Officer Brooks had no idea that his routine harassment of a teenage girl was about to shine a spotlight on years of departmental failures and systemic problems that could no longer be ignored. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as Special Agent Lee walked through the front doors, his FBI badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't alone. Agent Wilson followed with a laptop under her arm, and 2 more FBI agents brought up the rear. They moved with quiet purpose, their presence drawing worried glances from the desk officers. The station's night shift supervisor, Lieutenant Porter, hurried to meet them, his face a mask of professional concern. "Agent Lee, we can sort this out quickly," he began, but Agent Lee raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "First, I want to see my daughter," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the now quiet lobby. "Then we'll discuss the broader investigation that's about to begin." His words hung in the air, heavy with implications that made several officers shift uncomfortably. Maya was brought out from the holding area, still dignified despite the ordeal. The handcuffs had been removed, but the mark they'd left on her spirit was visible in her eyes. When she saw her father, her composure cracked slightly, but she held her head high. "You did everything right," Agent Lee told her softly, giving her a quick hug. "Now let us handle the rest." He turned to Lieutenant Porter, his expression hardening. "We'll need your conference room and access to all of Officer Brooks's records, now." The next few hours unfolded like a well-choreographed dance. Agent Wilson set up her laptop, projecting a wall of data that told a damning story. Photos from previous incidents flashed across the screen, complaint forms that had been buried, statistics that showed clear patterns of discrimination. Outside the conference room, word spread quickly through the station. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves. Some looked worried, others relieved, as if they'd been waiting for someone to finally address what they'd seen but never reported. "Look at this pattern," Agent Wilson pointed out to the growing audience of senior officers. Traffic stops concentrated in specific neighborhoods. Escalated incidents following a clear profile. Complaints disappeared into administrative black holes. Each point landed like a hammer blow, backed by irrefutable data. Officer Chen, the rookie who'd been at the scene, stepped forward voluntarily. "I have bodycam footage from tonight," he offered quietly. "And notes about other incidents I've witnessed." His voice shook slightly, but his resolve was clear. Other officers began to nod, some reaching for their phones, ready to share their own observations. In the station's break room, Maya sat with a cup of hot chocolate, watching the news coverage slowly build on the TV. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages of support from neighbors, classmates, even strangers who'd seen the videos online. Mrs. Thompson had organized a small group of neighbors who were standing outside the station, holding handmade signs calling for accountability. Agent Lee worked methodically, building a case that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter anymore. This had become about every person who'd ever been wrongly targeted, every officer who'd wanted to speak up but felt they couldn't, every community that had lost trust in those meant to protect them. "We're not looking to tear down the department," he explained to the police chief, who'd arrived looking disheveled and worried. "We want to help you rebuild it. Better training, better oversight, better relationships with the community. But first, we need to clean house." The evidence was overwhelming. Officer Brooks's record revealed a history of transfers between departments, each move happening just as complaints began to pile up. The pattern was clear. He'd been allowed to continue his behavior because no one had taken the time to connect the dots to see the full picture. As midnight approached, the station remained bustling with activity. FBI analysts had arrived, setting up temporary workstations. Officers were giving statements, sharing their own experiences and observations. What had started as one wrongful arrest was expanding into a full review of departmental practices. Maya watched her father work, proud of how he channeled his anger into action. He wasn't shouting or making threats. He was building a case so strong it couldn't be ignored, creating a moment of change that would ripple through the entire law enforcement community. Outside, more community members had gathered, their candles creating a warm glow in the darkness. They weren't an angry mob. They were citizens standing together, supporting reform, watching as justice began to unfold in their small corner of the world. The night that had started with one officer's prejudice was becoming a catalyst for lasting change, all because one father knew how to fight the system from within. The morning news vans arrived just as the sun was rising, their satellite dishes reaching into the pink sky like metal trees. Maya's dashboard camera footage had gone viral overnight, touching a nerve in communities across the country. The small-town police station had become the center of a national conversation about law enforcement accountability. Inside the station, Officer Brooks sat in an interview room, his confidence from the previous evening completely deflated. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just from Maya's case, but from dozens of others that had been uncovered during the night. His own body camera had mysteriously malfunctioned during several crucial incidents, a coincidence that nobody was buying anymore. The FBI's Civil Rights Division is officially involved now, Agent Wilson explained to the police chief, spreading documents across his desk. "We've identified at least 30 similar incidents in the past year alone." The chief's face grew more troubled with each page he turned, realizing the full scope of what had been happening under his watch. Local reporters clustered around Mrs. Thompson, who had become an unexpected spokesperson for the community. "We've lived here for 40 years," she told the cameras, her small dog still faithfully by her side. "We watch out for each other's children. When we saw what was happening to that sweet girl, we couldn't stay silent." The story spread like wildfire across social media. Maya's video had been shared millions of times, sparking discussions about racial profiling and police accountability. But unlike many viral police incidents, this one came with a solution already in motion, a professional, methodical response that was creating real change. Officer Chen, the rookie who'd spoken up, found himself surrounded by other young officers who shared his concerns. "We joined the force to help people," he told Agent Lee during his official statement. "What happened last night? That's not what we signed up for. We want to be part of the solution." By midday, the FBI had set up a dedicated hotline for community members to report similar incidents. The calls started pouring in immediately, not just about Officer Brooks, but about other incidents that people had been afraid to report. Each call was carefully logged, each story added to the growing mountain of evidence. Maya sat in her father's office at the FBI field headquarters, watching the investigation unfold. Her phone kept buzzing with messages of support from classmates and strangers alike. Someone had started a hashtag about her case that was trending nationally, but Maya wasn't interested in becoming famous. She wanted something more important, real change. "Look at this," Agent Wilson called out, pointing to her computer screen. She'd uncovered a pattern of internal complaints from other officers about Brooks, complaints that had been buried or ignored. The wall of silence was crumbling as more officers came forward, tired of watching their profession's reputation being tarnished by those who abused their power. The police chief held a press conference in the afternoon, looking tired but determined. "We're announcing immediate changes to our department's policies," he stated firmly. "New oversight measures, mandatory body camera reviews, and a civilian review board for all complaints. This isn't just about one incident or one officer, this is about rebuilding trust with our community." Community leaders from neighboring towns began arriving, wanting to learn from what was happening. They'd brought their own stories, their own statistics, their own concerns. What had started as one wrongful arrest was becoming a model for how to address systemic problems in law enforcement. In the evening, a spontaneous community meeting filled the local high school gymnasium. People from all walks of life came together: police officers, teachers, business owners, students. They weren't there to point fingers or assign blame. They were there to talk about how to move forward, how to create a department that truly served and protected everyone equally. Maya stood up to speak, her voice clear and strong. She didn't talk about revenge or punishment. Instead, she talked about hope, hope that her experience could help prevent others from facing similar discrimination. The room fell silent as she spoke, everyone recognizing that they were witnessing something powerful. A moment when fear and anger transformed into positive action. Outside the gym, the sun was setting on a day that had changed their community forever. Officer Brooks had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, but more importantly, real reforms were already being put into place. The system wasn't just punishing one bad officer, it was changing to prevent future abuses of power. The news crews were still there, but the story they were telling had evolved. This wasn't just another viral video of police misconduct. This was a story about how one community came together to create meaningful change, guided by professional law enforcement officers who refused to let injustice stand. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, the small-town police department looked very different. The old frosted glass doors had been replaced with clear ones, a symbolic gesture of transparency that reflected deeper changes within. The lobby now featured a community bulletin board covered with photos of joint police community events, and a new civilian oversight committee met regularly in the conference room. Officer Brooks had been terminated following a thorough investigation. More importantly, his case had led to a complete review of the department's hiring and supervision practices. The changes weren't just on paper, you could feel them in the atmosphere of the station itself, where officers now regularly engaged with community members who dropped by. Maya sat in her family's living room, watching a national news special about police reform. Her case had become a case study in how to handle departmental problems effectively. What made this different, the reporter explained, was the systematic approach to change, led by law enforcement professionals who understood both the problems and the solutions. The young officers who had spoken up, led by Officer Chen, had become leaders in the department's new mentoring program. They worked with veteran officers who shared their vision for community-oriented policing, creating training sessions that other departments were now asking to observe. "It's not about pointing fingers anymore," Officer Chen told a group of police cadets from the State Academy. "It's about building bridges and maintaining them." The cadets took notes eagerly. This department had become known as a model for modern policing, and everyone wanted to learn from their experience. Mrs. Thompson had turned her front yard into an unofficial community gathering spot, hosting weekly meetings where residents and police officers could chat over coffee and her famous homemade cookies. "Sometimes the simplest things make the biggest difference," she'd say, watching people who might never have spoken to each other sharing stories and finding common ground. The Civilian Review Board, initially met with skepticism by some officers, had proven its worth. They didn't just handle complaints. They also recognized officers who went above and beyond in community service. Their monthly meetings were well attended, and their recommendations were taken seriously by department leadership. Maya's father had been promoted within the FBI, now heading a new division focused on helping other departments implement similar reforms. "What happened to my daughter was wrong," he would say in his presentations, "but how we responded made all the difference. We chose progress over punishment, reform over revenge." The local high school had started a new program, sparked by Maya's experience. Students interested in law enforcement careers could intern with the police department, learning about both the responsibilities and the ethics of the profession. Maya herself had become a mentor in the program, helping bridge the gap between young people and law enforcement. Even the physical space around the police station had transformed. The parking lot where Maya had been wrongfully arrested now featured a small garden, maintained jointly by officers and community members. "From concrete to flowers," Mrs. Thompson would say, "just like our community, from hardness to growth." The changes rippled outward. Neighboring towns sent observers to learn from their success. State lawmakers studied their reforms while drafting new legislation. Police chiefs from across the country called to ask advice about implementing similar programs. But perhaps the most meaningful change could be seen in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. Traffic stops were handled professionally and respectfully. Officers knew they were accountable, and citizens knew they had a voice. The us versus them mentality that had allowed bad behavior to flourish had been replaced by a sense of shared community. 1 year after the incident, the town held a community celebration in the park. It wasn't about remembering the wrong that had been done, but about celebrating how far they'd come. Officers played basketball with local kids. Families shared potluck dishes. People who had once viewed each other with suspicion now sat together, planning future improvements for their community. Maya stood with her father, watching the celebration. "Sometimes good things come from bad situations," she said, smiling as she watched Officer Chen teaching a group of children about his patrol car's equipment. But only if people are brave enough to speak up and smart enough to work together. The sun set on the gathering, but the work continued. The department had learned that maintaining trust was an ongoing process, not a one-time fix. Every day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to prove that change was possible when people committed to making it happen. The story of one wrongful arrest had become a blueprint for positive change, proving that justice didn't have to be about punishment alone. It could be about transformation, about bringing people together, about turning a moment of crisis into an opportunity for lasting improvement. In the end, that was the most powerful lesson of all.